Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Taking a look at the advisories and warning that we have out for the state, similar picture to what we saw yesterday, where we have a winter weather advisory for snow and blowing snow up by the Dead Horse area. And that is going to be in effect until 6 p.m. this evening, so should be starting to improve here pretty soon. And then we also have the blizzard warning out a little bit to the east near AKwx, and that is going to be out until 9 p.m. this evening. And remember, those blizzard conditions can drop visibilities to a quarter mile or less in the winds and blowing snow. And also in the Fairbanks area, we do have the flood advisory that has been extended, now in effect until tomorrow afternoon, and that is for the Chena River near Hunts Creek. So keep in mind, if you're in that area, watch out for flooding with that ice jam that's causing some flooding on the river. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll start off west. We do have area of low pressure bringing some cloud cover and precipitation to the western Aleutians. We can watch again as we have a system south of the Alaska Peninsula pushing closer to the area. Not quite there yet, but we can see some of the cloud cover out in advance of this system. If we look really far up to the north, we can see a trough that's pushing through, bringing in some colder air and snow. That's one of the causes for the blizzard warning that we have out there in the northeastern coastline. And then finally, we can look out over the Panhandle area, where we have some onshore flow bringing in some precipitation to the Panhandle as well. Taking a look now, we do have some of that rain pushing into the Panhandle area. Primarily is going to be rain until we get to the far northern locations, especially at elevation where we will see a mix towards snow, but we'll see rain all along the coastline through Kodiak Island and the Bristol Bay area. As we push up into the Alaska Range and areas in the central and eastern portions of the interior, we expect a mix of rain and snow, where lower elevations will primarily be rain, higher elevations expecting to be snow. Then up along the Arctic coastline, where that front's moving, and we do have snow all throughout the North Slope area. Down in the Panhandle or in the Alaska Peninsula, we do have some rain that's extending out over the Aleutian Islands. Then as we look into tonight, some of the ridging that's up over northeastern Russia extending down, clearing out some of the Aleutians, but we still have some rain over the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, especially as our low is pushing closer towards the area, bringing out more warm air and moisture from the south, bringing rain to Kodiak Island as well. Then rain all along the North Gulf Coast into the Panhandle area, and in all these locations we are expecting some of the higher elevations to start to mix with snow, especially as we move further to the north and more inland. Then as we get into the Alaska Range and interior, we are expecting some snow, especially in eastern locations. And then up along that Arctic coastline, we are expecting to continue to have snow through tonight. Moving into Thursday, lingering snow showers up along the Arctic coast are expected. We'll have snow out over the eastern portions of the interior as well. And then with our low approaching the Alaska Peninsula and that southerly winds pushing throughout the Gulf of Alaska, we are expecting continued rain from the Bristol Bay area through the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle. And again, once we get to further inland locations, especially as we get to higher elevations, expecting to see some snow mix in. So look out over the eastern Aleutians, a mix of rain and snow is expected. And then rain for the western Aleutians as we have another frontal system pushing in from the west. Then on Friday, that system is going to push out by the central Aleutians, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the area, mix of rain and snow for the eastern Aleutians, and then rain from the Alaska Peninsula through Bristol Bay, along the North Gulf Coast, throughout all of South Central and down into the Panhandle, expecting primarily rain, once again at northern locations, and as we get to higher elevation, expecting a mix of snow. And then some areas of snow and mix of rain and snow for the eastern portions of the interior. But high pressure will move in along the Arctic coastline, keeping precipitation further to the south. For our temperatures, we'll start off Thursday morning in the Panhandle area, dropping down to right around 40 degrees. Mid-30s for much of South Central. That will extend out towards the Bristol Bay area as well. So move up to the YK Delta area, temperatures dropping down into the 20s. That will be true for much of the interior as well. And then as we move further to the north, temperatures continuing to drop lower. Kotzebue Sound area into the teens. And then as we move up along the Arctic coastline, western locations into the teens for lows, and eastern locations dropping down into the single digits, with AKwx getting down to 4 degrees. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, we are expecting temperatures to drop to the mid to upper 30s, and then right around freezing for much of the rest of the Aleutian Islands, 25 expected low for the Pribilofs. High temperatures on Thursday afternoon, getting up into the 40s for the Aleutian Islands and then to the Alaska Peninsula as well. Warmer by the Bristol Bay area, mid to upper 40s are expected. That will extend out over much of south central as well. Again, as we push north, we are going to see temperatures a little bit cooler, getting up into the upper 30s to right around 40 degrees for all throughout the interior. Down in the YK Delta area, getting up to around 30 degrees to some areas like Bethel, getting up towards 41. Then in the 20s for the Seward Peninsula area, 20s all along the Arctic coastline as well. And then down in the Panhandle, getting into the mid 40s. Friday morning lows dropping down to right around 40 degrees for the Panhandle area. Yakutat a little bit colder, 36 degrees is expected. Mid to upper 30s for the south central and southwestern portions of the state. Moving up towards the Norton Sound area, dropping down into the 20s. Going to be true of much of the southern portions of the interior as well. Northern interior dropping down into the teens. That's going to be true for much of the Seward Peninsula into the Kotzebue Sound area. And along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to right around 0 degrees with some locations dropping below 0. We are going to see Arctic Village, coldest in the state, getting down to -6. Then down in the Aleutian Islands, we are going to see temperatures dropping to right around freezing again, with the Pribilof Islands dropping into the mid-20s. Friday afternoon highs, mid to upper 30s for much of the Aleutians, getting up into the 40s for the Alaska Peninsula. Then mid to upper 40s to right around 50 for much of the southern mainland, and then getting up into the 30s for the interior, into the teens for the Arctic coastline, into the 40s for the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea, we have some MVFR and IFR conditions, especially in easterly locations. We do have primarily IFR. That IFR is going to extend into the Bristol Bay area and through all of south central Alaska, through the Gulf of Alaska, and into southeast Alaska. As we move north in mainland Alaska, we start to become MVFR for the YK Delta area, much of the interior as well. And then some areas of VFR as we get closer towards the upper Yukon Valley. And as we get to the north side of the Brooks Range, we're going to drop back down to MVFR conditions. Thursday afternoon, going to continue to see MVFR conditions along much of the north slope. Primarily VFR for the interior and primarily MVFR for south central Alaska and southwest Alaska. Out over the Bering and Aleutians, we do have primarily MVFR conditions with some areas of IFR expected. And then down in the Panhandle, we are expecting MVFR conditions Thursday afternoon. Friday morning, going to clear up for much of the Panhandle, especially in the inside waters areas. Going to see a lot of VFR conditions Friday morning. But we will still have some MVFR and IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast and throughout all of the Gulf of Alaska. Those IFR conditions are going to extend into south central Alaska as well, with some MVFR conditions for southwest Alaska, and then primarily VFR conditions for the interior, with continued MVFR conditions along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we do have a mix of MVFR and IFR conditions. So we move into Friday afternoon, pretty similar conditions for much of the Bering and Aleutians. However, there is a small area of VFR conditions expected between the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. We will have MVFR conditions for places along the coast for southwest Alaska and into south central Alaska, but then our VFR conditions for much of the mainland up through the Arctic coastline with just some isolated areas of MVFR along the coast. As we move down into the Panhandle area, expecting primarily MVFR conditions with some IFR conditions expected in the Yakutat area. For the passes, AKwx should be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday, as well as Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off IFR and then improve to MVFR conditions. Rainy Pass, also IFR, improving to MVFR, as well as at Windy Pass. Isabel Pass, also going to start IFR, improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Mentasta should be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday. Dehne Pass will start off IFR, improve to marginal in the afternoon. And Portage will stay down in IFR conditions throughout the day. Chilkoot and White, both going to start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions later in the day. For our freezing levels, our surface freezing line rides to the north of the Panhandle area, then through south central and southwest Alaska, exiting out through the Bering. We have some areas of freezing levels up to as high as 4,000 feet approaching the Panhandle area, with as high as 6,000 feet to the south. For our icing all along the Gulf coastline, we do have icing starting out east by the Panhandle between 3,000 and 7,000 feet, between 3,000 and 8,000 feet for south central, and then above 5,000 as we get out by the Bristol Bay area and down into the Alaska Peninsula. Way out west by the western Aleutians, between 3,000 and 7,000 feet is expected, and then up by St. Lawrence Island, below 3,000 feet expected there, and another area below 3,000 feet along the Arctic coastline into the Brooks Range. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet that's going over our area is going to be around 90 knots out of the west by the western Aleutians, and that will pick up to 120 knots as it pushes off into the North Pacific. We also have an area of 75 knots pushing into the eastern Aleutians, and along the Arctic coastline up to as high as 70 knots out of the north, and then another area of 70 knots out over the Panhandle. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, we have westerly winds over the Panhandle around 30 knots, getting up to as high as 40 knots over the far eastern portions of mainland Alaska. Northerly flow along the Arctic coastline, getting up to as high as 35 knots over the northwest portions, and then through the Bering Strait around 25 knots. 40 knots of wind out over Kodiak Island out of a southeasterly direction. Lighter winds through much of the rest of the Bering and Aleutians, but getting up to as high as 40 knots out of the southeast by the western Aleutians. Down to 3,000 feet, going to continue to have stronger winds by the western Aleutians. Southeasterly flow, 35 to 40 knots is expected. Then flow around our low pressure system by the Alaska Peninsula, 35 knots on that eastern side out of the southeast, and 25 knots on the western side out of the northeast. Up the west coast, we're going to start to diminish, but as we get by the Bering Strait area, at 25 knots out of a northeasterly direction, lighter winds through much of the rest of mainland Alaska, with just some lighter areas of 20 knots out of a north to east direction out along the Arctic coastline, and then around 20 knots to the north of the Panhandle area out of the west. For our turbulence, down in southeast, we are going to see below 5,000 feet. Below 4,000 feet is expected by the Alaska Peninsula. And finally, as we get out by the western Aleutian Islands, below 3,000 feet is expected for our turbulence.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty. You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them, and you don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about 1/3 of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For our marine section, we'll start off with a look at our ice edge. With some of the northerly winds, we have seen the ice shift a little bit to the south-southwest. However, we are still seeing many breaks along the ice edge and up into the shore-fast ice, and that's going to continue to develop and continue to see more of those breaks in between the ice, with almost open water off some of the areas of shore-fast in the Kuskokwim Delta area. For southeast on Thursday, we'll start in the inside waters. We have southerly winds 10 to 25 knots, strongest as we get further to the north. And then out over the Gulf of Alaska, southwesterly winds 10 to 15 knots, seas as high as 7 feet. As we move into Friday, flow out over the Gulf is going to shift to the southeast. 25 to 30 knots is expected, with seas 8 to 9 feet. In the inside waters, south to southeast flow 10 to 15 knots, seas around 3 feet. For Thursday, in the south central area, we'll start off in the Gulf. Much of the Gulf is going to be an easterly wind, 10 to 20 knots, strongest by the Barren Islands, and easterly winds 20 knots on the west side of the Barren Islands as well. East 10 knots for Cook Inlet area, and then east 10 for Prince William Sound. Seas up to as high as 5 to 6 feet out over the Gulf. For Friday, flow becoming more northeasterly for much of the Gulf and Prince William Sound area. Out over the Gulf, 25 knots is expected with seas as high as 8 feet. Prince William Sound a little bit weaker, 10 knots expected there. Then to the west of the Barren Islands, northeasterly winds, 25 knots. And then in Cook Inlet, northerly winds, 10 to 15 knots, strongest as we get further to the south. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, primarily an easterly wind. For most locations, we're looking at 20 to 25 knots around Kodiak Island, and then 15 to 20 for the peninsula, weaker off to the west. Seas as high as 8 feet, strongest on the Pacific side. For Friday, still somewhat of an easterly flow, 15 knots on the Pacific side, 20 knots on the Bering side, and then 20 knots out of the northeast through Shelikof Strait. Seas as high as 8 feet, again the highest on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands, starting with the central and eastern Aleutians, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots are expected, becoming easterly by the western Aleutians with seas up to as high as 7 feet, and those wind speeds for the western Aleutians up to as high as 25 knots. For Friday, staying out by the western Aleutians, east to northeast winds around 30 knots with seas as high as 12 feet. For the central Aleutians, easterly winds 20 to 25 knots, and that wind is going to shift and become a northwesterly as we get by the eastern Aleutians, with winds up to as high as 20 knots, highest as we get further to the east. Along the west coast of the state, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots, seas as high as 5 feet, highest by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Friday, northeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots for most locations, a little bit stronger by the Pribilof Islands, up to as high as 25 knots there, seas up to as high as 7 feet. Along the Arctic coastline, we are going to see winds out of a east or to north direction around 10 knots. And then down the west coast of the state, we do see winds starting off at around 10 knots out of the north, picking up to as high as 20 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait. On Friday, flow is going to continue to be out of a primarily northerly direction along the west coast, again stronger by the Bering Strait up to as high as 20 knots there, diminishing down to 10 knots as we get further to the north, and then along the Arctic coastline, variable winds 5 to 10 knots. For our recap weather for tonight, we are going to see a low pressure system approaching the Alaska Peninsula, continuing to bring southerly winds out over the Gulf of Alaska area, which will bring rain to areas along the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, throughout south central Alaska, and into the Panhandle. We do expect areas that are further inland and at higher elevations to see a mix of snow. And then as we get into the interior, central, and eastern portions, we're going to see some light snow as well. Then up along the Arctic coastline, we do have a frontal system continuing to push through. We are still seeing some blowing snow conditions out along the northeastern portions, where we do have that blizzard warning out by the Kaktovik area until 9 p.m. this evening. And then down in the eastern Aleutians, we are going to see some rain, but we do have ridging out over the central and western Aleutians, keeping precipitation off to the east. However, as we move into Thursday, a new frontal system approaching from the Pacific towards the western Aleutians is going to bring some rain to the islands. And our other low by the Alaska Peninsula continues to move closer and also continues to bring southerly winds off of the Gulf to areas all along the North Gulf Coast from Kodiak through south central and into the Panhandle, continuing to bring rain to those locations. Once again, in the more further inland and higher elevation areas, expecting that to be primarily snow. We're also going to see some snow in the eastern portions of the interior, and then lighter snow along the Arctic coastline. Down in the eastern Aleutians, a mix of rain and snows, we are starting to pull back some of the colder air with the northerly winds for the eastern Aleutians. Then on Friday, we're going to see more rain along all of the North Gulf Coast and through much of the Aleutian Islands.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.